As a young boy, Nicodemus was a prodigy, the star pupil for the most respected rabbis, with wisdom beyond his years and a keen mind for the tiniest details of Mosaic law. He was a natural. Coming from a prominent family of wealth and influence, it surprised nobody when he became a rising star within the Jewish faith, appointed at a very young age by the high priest to the esteemed Jewish ruling council. Once there, he approached his responsibilities of his faith and position with zeal, convinced fidelity to Mosaic law provided the pathway to appeasing God, toward a righteous life living in the glow of God's approval. As he grew older, however, he started to question things he once took for granted. A life dedicated to following God's rules should create a sense of peace within people, right? The satisfaction of a life lived in harmony with God should be its own reward. Unfortunately, that wasn't what Nicodemus so often saw. He saw people burdened with life, just trying to survive, let alone satisfying the requirements of their faith. God could seem so demanding. When he looked into the eyes of many of his flock, he saw the frustration with empty promises. Without realizing it, he began wondering if some of the things he believed even mattered. So often, God felt distant. In his darkest moments, Nicodemus questioned God's very existence. His faith was being shaken, and he didn't know what to do. When he looked into the mirror, he saw an aging, listless man, caged in the veneer of piety, while at the same time questioning everything on which he had built his life. In an effort to regain some of his lost passion for the faith, Nicodemus decided to take on younger pupils, and maybe some with less esteemed pedigrees. Life on the ruling council could be so insular, and he needed fresh blood in his life, especially now. He needed someone to remind him of why he was there. The first day he met young Steve, he was concerned that maybe he bit off a bit more than he could chew. Steve was the youngest son of his sister's best friend, Maureen, and while he seemed bright enough, the kid could talk a mile a minute. He was a pathological motor mouth. Nicodemus wasn't sure if Steve ever inhaled. After their first session together, Nicodemus nearly called the whole thing off, but reconsidered after a sleepless evening spent wandering through the book of Job in deep commiseration. The second session started out as a carbon copy of the first. However, something Steve said early in the conversation intrigued Nicodemus. The afternoon before, Steve happened upon a young rabbi preaching outside the synagogue, and the rabbi obviously captured Steve's imagination. The rabbi was talking about transcending Mosaic law to something greater, a life of love, a new understanding of God apart from the law, and Steve couldn't stop talking about it. The more Steve talked, the more Nicodemus wanted to know about this young rabbi. He was mesmerized by the words Steve recounted, wanting to hear more. At the same time, he was sensitive to not appearing too interested. In the course of the conversation, Steve said the rabbi, who was named Jesus, was speaking again that very evening at a coffee house near the drive-in theater, and he wanted to go hear him for the second day in a row. Nicodemus had heard about Jesus. He was a lightning rod and attracting the attention of some on the high council for supposedly denigrating the law of Moses. He was even purported to be healing people, raising the charlatan red flags. Whereas others on the council privately expressed concern at the things Jesus was telling audiences, Nicodemus was intrigued by what he heard. Nicodemus wanted to hear Jesus speak. Showing more urgency than he intended, Nicodemus asked Steve if he would like company, so they agreed to go together. On the way to the coffee house that evening, Nicodemus felt self-conscious. A Pharisee of his standing probably shouldn't be attending this event, this talk, with this upstart preacher, especially if his talk had anything to do with transcending the law of Moses, as Steve said. This young rabbi hadn't earned such an audience yet. Still, if anyone asked, he could say he was listening out of concern for what this young rabbi was saying, in order to protect the faith. The others would understand this. Nicodemus felt disingenuous and weak for even entertaining such justifying thoughts. When they arrived, Jesus was just getting there. There was nothing remarkable about his appearance, except for the way many of the people gathered, reverently cleared a path through the crowd to make way for him, eager to hear him speak. He had a way about him that was both unpretentious and wise, and he seemed afraid of nothing. His gaze was penetrating but kind. When Jesus spoke, he expressed a moral clarity Nicodemus hadn't experienced before. He talked about the ways in which people relate to one another. Is this how you would treat your mother, your brother? Would you deny them sustenance, simple kindness? He was pointing out how people get so caught up in the enforcement of arcane laws that the reason for the laws, creating a society of people who cared for one another as brothers and sisters, friends and neighbors, is completely lost. He said that we are not here to judge one another, to see each other's flaws and punish each other accordingly, but instead we are here to love your God, your neighbor, yourself. He advocated that we need to take a step back to see that our God is the God of love, and that this is paramount above all else. He said that the reason Moses had to create the laws in the first place was that people lost sight of this simple command to love. Nicodemus felt his heart stirring inside of him. He struggled to hold back a spontaneous burst of tears, hearing the truth spoken in a way as never before, this truth for which he was hungering. He was striving not to show it, though. Others were moved further. This man Jesus was so radiant with God's light that a simple touch on the shoulder as he moved about the people seemed to have a healing effect, even for afflictions with no cure. How was he doing this? Nicodemus had never seen anything like it. In spite of his efforts, he could barely contain the way his spirit soared in the presence of this man. He felt embarrassed, desperate to regain control of his senses. When Jesus finished speaking, the crowd was so enraptured that it seemed like they may not let him go, pulling at him, wanting more of him before he left their presence. His disciples gently but firmly disentangled him from the still growing crowd and whisked him away. Nicodemus felt a desperation to speak to this man. So many questions rattled his soul. He needed to speak to him. It was imperative. He noticed where Jesus' disciples were taking him, so he and Steve cut through a side alley to catch up. They were moving quickly in the dark night as the crowd, now without Jesus, began dissipating. Free from the crowd, Jesus and the disciples slowed to a regular pace by the time Nicodemus found them. Calling out to get their attention, Nicodemus introduced himself as a member of the High Council, asking if he could take a moment of Jesus' time. Jesus stopped and gave Nicodemus his full, penetrating attention. Steve, standing beside Nicodemus, was surprised by the deferential manner in which Nicodemus said to Jesus, "Rabbi, we know that you are a teacher who has come from God, for no one could perform the signs you are doing if God were not with him." Jesus, sensing there must be a question in there somewhere, responded, "And you want to know how it is that I can do these things, right?" Nicodemus felt slightly insulted to have his question broken down so simply. "Yes," he nodded in the affirmative. Jesus studied Nicodemus as if he were gauging his sincerity. He then replied, "Here's the truth. You won't be able to see or understand the beauty about which I'm talking unless you are born again." "What are you talking about?" asked Nicodemus, not sure if he was just insulted. Sarcasm reflexively wormed its way into his voice. "I'm incapable of understanding what you're saying unless I crawl back into my mother's womb and am somehow born again?" He was becoming suspicious that Jesus was just toying with him, possibly for the entertainment of those gathered around. Maybe there was a good reason to be suspicious of this upstart preacher. It would have been easy for Jesus to respond to Nicodemus's sarcasm, but he didn't. "You're not hearing me," Jesus said, "but I'm telling you the truth. You have to learn to see the world with fresh eyes. Right now you see the world through the ways of flesh, born of flesh. You see the world through the eyes that see rules and limits, where fear and oppression are tools to control others, where one man gets ahead by pushing the other behind, where each of us holds the keys to our own salvation from a fearsome and judgmental God." Our only hope lies in carefully observing rules laid out by Moses, offering sacrifices when we fall short. What you sense in me, however, is not this type of thinking, this thinking from the flesh. Mine is from the Spirit, God's Spirit, embedded deep inside each of us, as if written onto our DNA. The only way to find it is to die to the ways of the flesh, to let go of those ways, to throw yourself fully into the arms and mercy of a God who is love and who embodies unlimited forgiveness in ways that you cannot fathom right now. If you can see this, die to your current understanding of life, he continued. You will find freedom and beauty previously unimaginable to you, as God's Spirit will take you on a marvelous adventure in this amazing life. How could this be? Condescended Nicodemus, as if Jesus was speaking in some code he couldn't translate. It was like gibberish to him. While Nicodemus had been feeling trapped in his old ways of thinking, this young rabbi was taking it way too far. Nicodemus's hackles were rising up. You're part of the Jewish ruling council, and yet you don't understand this? Asked Jesus. You came here tonight to hear me speak, and you have witnessed firsthand God's Spirit in our midst, but you still cling to the old ways, to the ways of flesh. You came here to hear me speak, but you refuse to listen to my words. You cannot accept what I say and let go of those things, so you cannot understand my words when I discuss the nature of God's light buried inside of everyone, including you. If only you can get your pride and ego out of the way. Nobody had ever spoken to Nicodemus this way, not even when he was a young child. And yet Jesus wasn't finished. God sent me to share God's light with the world, but you refuse to see the light. And this has real consequences to you and to others. But you may never understand the consequences of your actions, he said. And then he added prophetically, until they result in the death of the very one you came here tonight to hear speak, the very one whose words made your heart sing. Then, maybe, you and others like you might be able to reflect back on the consequences of your decisions and understandings, and the sickness and death that travels in their wake. Maybe then you'll finally see. Jesus continued, make no mistake, though, I'm not here to condemn you or anyone else. Our God of love sent me to share God's light of love with all people, so that all may have the opportunity to listen, to transcend death and embrace eternal life through me. But many won't. Many people prefer darkness instead of light because they do evil. They would rather live their distorted fantasy than be cleansed by the truth. They would rather be broken and incomplete than reconcile with the God of love and forgiveness. That did it. Nicodemus was insulted. He was certain. At least it felt that way, but actually, he wasn't completely sure. Come on, he said to Steve as he turned and walked away. On the walk back to their neighborhood, Steve held his tongue for a while as they walked in silence. Pretty soon, however, he couldn't contain himself any longer. Ignoring Nicodemus's after-conversation with Jesus, Steve prattled on nonstop with excitement for this young rabbi's message, but Nicodemus barely registered any of it. His brain felt like a freshly shaken snow globe, thoughts swirling around, jumbled together but oddly inaccessible, just out of reach of his consciousness. He felt completely numb, and yet strangely alive. One thing Jesus said really stuck with him about the sickness and death traveling in the wake of a life strictly dedicated to the law of Moses. He thought about Moses leading his people through the wilderness, all those years wandering, seemingly aimlessly, all of his cranky and wayward followers. What it must have been like to be there. He had heard those stories since he was a young boy. One rabbi of his had a penchant for telling the stories like he was there, a first-hand account, which seemed plausible because he looked old enough to have been a brother of Moses. One story in particular stayed with him all these years, and Nicodemus has been afraid of snakes ever since. While we weren't exactly starving, his rabbi would say, we were sick of what little food we had, and there wasn't enough water to go around. We were miserable. So we all just started grousing about it. We were so angry with Moses, and God too. Why would they bring us out into the wilderness, seemingly just to suffer? We were better off in slavery. Then, as if things weren't already bad enough, we had to deal with an infestation of poisonous snakes who would slither amongst us, especially late at night while looking for a warm place to rest their cold-blooded bodies. Oh, I remember the shrieks of terror as people woke to the feeling of reptilian scales sliding against their bodies, and the strike of a venomous creature piercing the skin, the screams, the paralysis, and soon enough, the death. Fear and worry filled the camp as several people died from bites. I myself barely managed to escape once. Soon we were all convinced that God sent the snakes, and Moses, so sick of our constant complaining, did nothing to dispel this notion. Yes, Moses said, God is tired of your infernal complaining, and so am I. These snakes are punishment for your inability to feel any gratitude whatsoever and make my life miserable in the process. Then he commanded everyone to move the camp a few hundred cubits further from the river. Whatever Moses intended when he said that God was angry with their infernal complaining, it seemed to backfire. What started out as fear and worrying soon bloomed into full-blown hysteria. Moses regretted fanning those flames since there didn't seem to be a rational person in the whole camp. Soon enough, we all started begging Moses to pray to God to take the snakes away. Moses seemed like he was about to pull his hair out and stormed off. At first, we thought that maybe he had abandoned us, and we prayed for him to return to save us from the snakes. Apparently, however, he just went off and prayed to God. When he returned, he told us that God told him to make a bronze serpent for us to look at if we got bitten by a snake. If we did this, we wouldn't die. And it worked. Of course, nobody really got bit again once we moved our camp further from the river. When Nicodemus first heard the story so many years ago, it all sounded so real. But now, as he contemplated it, he marveled at Moses' pragmatism. Sure, he basically made a bronze idol to quell his people's hysteria, violating one of the Ten Commandments. But it worked. And, as a bonus, the bronze idol helped nip the complaining, since it was a reminder of its consequences. As Nicodemus was laying down to bed that night, he thought about the conversation with Jesus, of Jesus' warning about the consequences of a life devoted to law rather than love, of how it would result in Jesus' death. In an odd way, Jesus and his death would become like Moses' bronze serpent, a reminder to the people. In Jesus' case, it would remind people to live by love in all things, and the consequences if people chose not to. He wondered if it would come to pass. He wondered if Jesus was right about the law of Moses. He wondered about everything Jesus said.